Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Margaret Rosewood, and I've been a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 9 years. People think being a ranger is all about rescuing lost hikers and spotting black bears, but in Cataloochee Valley, my real job is taking care of the dead. I don't mean that in a creepy way. I maintain the old churches and homesteads, the places where families lived before the government made them leave back in the 1920 seconds. I keep the grass cut around the grave markers. I lead tours and tell visitors about the Palmer family and the Caldwells and all the others who called this valley home. It's honest work, and I'm good at it. The thing is, I'm from here. My great-grandmother grew up in this valley before they turned it into a park. She used to tell me stories that made my skin crawl. Stories about a woman who screams in the morning mist, a mother searching for her babies, but I never believed any of it. Great-grandma was old, and old people remember things funny. Sometimes. That was before October 1979. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. The fall colors were perfect reds and golds covering the mountains like a quilt. I was unlocking the visitor center when a family came running up to me. The mom was crying, and the dad kept looking back over his shoulder, like something was chasing them. "There's a woman out there," the father said. His hands were shaking. By the old Palmer house, she was screaming, just screaming and screaming. Their little boy, maybe 7 years old, was hiding behind his mother's legs. What did she look like? I asked, pulling out my notebook. Sometimes homeless folks wandered into the valley, though it was rare. She was wearing a white dress, the mother said, old-fashioned looking, and she was see-through. I could see the trees behind her. I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. "See-through? We're not crazy," the father said quickly. All three of us saw her, heard to her. It was the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. I told them it was probably fog playing tricks on their eyes. I gave the kid a Junior Ranger sticker and sent them on their way. But after they left, I sat in my truck for a long minute, staring at the Palmer homestead across the valley. The house stood alone in a clearing, its logs dark with age. Someone had restored it in the 1960 seconds, tried to make it look like it did when the Palmers lived there. But no amount of work could make it feel lived in. It was a shell, a memory made of wood. I drove over there anyway. It was my job to check it out. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could name right away. Just a feeling, like when you walk into your house and know someone's been there, even though nothing's out of place. The air was cold. Too cold for October. My breath came out in clouds, and I could see frost on the grass even though it was nearly 60 degrees, according to my thermometer. I walked around the house, checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked up tight, just like I'd left it yesterday. No signs of break-ins, no footprints in the soft ground except mine and the tourists from earlier. But when I walked past the side window, I stopped. There were handprints on the glass, small ones, child-sized. On the inside, I'd cleaned those windows myself last week. I knew they'd been spotless. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Margaret, you copy?" It was Tom, my supervisor. I pressed the button with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "Yeah, I'm here. Got another call about a screaming woman in Cataloochee. Third one this morning. You see anything?" I looked at those little handprints again. "No," I said. "Nothing." I should have told Tom about the handprints. I should have called someone. But what would I say? That there were tiny handprints inside a locked building? That the air felt wrong? That I was starting to believe my great-grandmother's stories? Instead, I spent the next 2 days trying to find normal explanations. I checked every visitor log going back 2 weeks. Nobody had signed in to tour the Palmer house except people I'd personally escorted. I tested my thermometer. It worked fine everywhere except near the homestead. I brought my camera to take pictures of the property, but when I got them developed, half the shots were just white fog, even though the day had been clear. By Thursday, I'd convinced myself I was losing it. Too much time alone in the mountains. too many of great-grandma's stories rattling around in my head. Then I met James Whitmore. He was a college kid from Tennessee, studying history. He'd come to Cataloochee to research his family tree, and it turned out he was related to the Palmers. Distant cousin, several times removed, but family nonetheless. "I'm particularly interested in Ella Palmer," he told me, spreading old documents across the visitor center table. "She's sort of the tragic figure of the family." "I don't know that story," I admitted. James looked up, surprised. "Really? I thought everyone around here knew about Ella. She lost everything." He showed me a photograph, brown with age. A woman stood in front of the Palmer house, unsmiling in the way people never smiled in old photos. She was pretty, with dark hair pulled back tight. 3 children stood around her, 2 girls and a boy, all under 10. "That's Ella with her kids," James said. "Taken in 1918. Within a year, all 3 children were dead. Influenza took the girls in the winter. The boy drowned in the creek that spring. I felt sick. All 3? Gets worse. Her husband, Robert, died in a logging accident 6 months later. Ella was completely alone, and then in 1926, the government came through and told everyone they had to leave. They were making the valley into a park." "Where did Ella go?" James shook his head. "Nobody knows. She disappeared. Some family members said she couldn't leave her children's graves, but when they came back to move the bodies to the new cemetery, she was gone. The graves were different." "Different how?" "Someone had dug them up, not to move the bodies, they were still there. But all 3 graves had been opened and filled in again, like someone needed to see them one more time." I thought about those small handprints on the window. "Can you show me where the children are buried?" I asked. The Palmer family cemetery sat on a hill behind the house, surrounded by a low stone wall. Most of the markers had fallen over or sunk into the ground, but James knew which ones belonged to Ella's children. Sarah Palmer, 1910 to 1919. Elizabeth Palmer, 1912 to 1919. Robert Palmer Jr., 1914 to 1919. 3 graves, all in a row, James said softly. Ella used to put flowers on them every single day. The neighbors said they could hear her up here, talking to them like they were still alive. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the cemetery. I wanted to leave, but something made me stay. "My great-grandmother used to tell me about a woman who screams in this valley," I said, "a mother looking for her children." James went very still. When did she hear this? She grew up here. Would have been the 1920 seconds, around the time everyone had to leave. "Do you believe in ghosts, Margaret?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A scream, high and terrible, full of so much pain it didn't sound human. It came from the direction of the Palmer house, echoing off the mountains until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. James grabbed my arm. "What is that?" The scream came again, and this time I heard words in it. "My babies! Where are my babies?" I'd heard plenty of animals in these mountains. Foxes can sound like screaming women, and bobcats even worse. But this was no animal. This was a human voice, soaked in grief, so deep it made my chest hurt. "We need to go," I said. "Now." We ran down the hill, past the house, toward where I'd parked the truck. But as we passed the front window, I saw her. A woman in a white dress, standing in the doorway of the house. She was pale, almost glowing in the dimming light. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and her eyes looked right at me. She looked exactly like the photograph James had shown me. Ella Palmer. She opened her mouth and screamed again, and the sound was so full of longing and loss that I understood, deep in my bones, that she would never stop. She would search forever for children who were already dead. James saw her too. He made a sound like a hurt animal and stumbled backward. "That's her. That's Ella, but she can't be." The woman in white started walking toward us. Not fast, but steady, purposeful. I grabbed James and pulled him to the truck. My hands shook so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I finally got it started and looked back, Ella was standing in the middle of the road, watching us drive away. Even through the closed windows, I could hear her crying. I called in sick for the first time in 9 years. I couldn't go back to Cataloochee. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ella Palmer's face. Every quiet moment, I heard her screaming. But on Saturday morning, Tom called me. "Margaret, I need you to come in. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Just come in, please." Tom's office was crowded when I got there. 2 sheriff's deputies, a couple I didn't recognize, and Tom looking like he hadn't slept in days. "This is the Hendersons," Tom said. "They were camping in Cataloochee last night with their kids. Tell Margaret what happened, Mrs." Henderson's eyes were red from crying. "Our son is 7. Last night, he woke us up screaming. He said a woman in white came to our tent. She looked in at him and called him Robert." My stomach dropped. "Robert?" She kept saying, "Robert, my baby boy, I've found you." She tried to open the tent. My husband had to hold the zipper closed while I grabbed our son. We could hear her outside, crying and begging us to let her see her baby. "Mr." Henderson's voice was shaky. "She didn't leave until sunrise. Just stood outside our tent all night, calling for Robert. Robert Palmer Jr., Ella's son who drowned. We're closing the valley," Tom said. "At least temporarily, until we figure out what's going on." "You can't close it," I said. It's October. We're about to have our busiest season. I've had 15 complaints in the last week about a screaming woman. 3 families say she approached them directly. One man said she touched his daughter, and the kid's hand went numb for 2 hours. Tom looked me straight in the eye. "What's happening in Cataloochee, Margaret?" I thought about lying, but the Hendersons looked terrified. And somewhere in the valley, Ella Palmer was searching for children who weren't hers to find. "I think it's Ella Palmer," I said quietly. "The mother who lost her children. I think she can't accept they're gone." The deputies looked at each other. One of them actually laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Ghosts aren't real," Tom said, but he didn't sound certain. "Then what's touching visitors? What's calling their children by the name of a boy who died 60 years ago?" I pulled out the photograph James had given me. "This is Ella. Every person who's seen this woman has described her exactly the same way." Mrs. Henderson looked at the photo and started crying. "That's her. That's who was at our tent." Tom rubbed his face. "Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say there's something out there. What do we do about it?" I'd been thinking about that since Thursday. I'd been doing research too, reading everything I could find about Ella Palmer and the valley's history. "I think we, who need to help her understand her children are at peace," I said. "She's searching because she doesn't know they're okay, because the government made her leave before she could say goodbye." "How do you help a ghost understand anything?" one deputy asked. I didn't have a good answer for that, but I knew someone who might. James Whitmore came back to Cataloochee that afternoon. He brought books about Appalachian burial customs, letters from family members who remembered Ella, and old photographs of the children. In this culture, it was important for families to tend their dead, James explained, to keep the graves clean, to put out flowers, to visit and talk to them. When Ella was forced to leave, it would have broken something fundamental in her. She promised to watch over her babies, and the government made her break that promise. "So she came back," I said, "and she's been searching ever since." We stood in the visitor center as the sun set, planning what to our four do. Tom had closed the valley to visitors, but Ella didn't care about our schedules. She'd be out there tonight calling for her children. "I'm going up to the cemetery," I said. "I'm going to try to talk to her." "That's insane," Tom said flatly. "You saw what she did to the Hendersons. She's not trying to hurt anyone. She's just desperate. She's been alone and scared for 60 years. James stood up. "I'm going with you. She's my family. If anyone should talk to her, it's me." We drove to the Palmer homestead just before midnight. The moon was full, turning everything silver and strange. The house looked different at night, older, sadder, more real somehow. The temperature dropped as soon as we got out of the truck. Our breath made clouds in the air, and frost glittered on the grass. "Ella," I called out. "Ella Palmer, we want to help you." Nothing. Just the sound of wind in the trees and the distant rush of the creek. James walked toward the cemetery. "Ella, it's family. I'm Robert's cousin, many times over. I have pictures of your children. I have letters from people who knew them." Still nothing. Then, softly at first, we heard crying. It came from inside the house. I looked at James. He nodded. Together, we walked to the front door. It was unlocked, though I knew I'd locked it myself. Inside, the house was dark, except for moonlight coming through the windows. Everything looked exactly as it should. The old furniture, the stone fireplace, the photographs on the wall, except for the woman sitting in the rocking chair. She was clearer now, more solid than when I'd seen her before. She wore a simple white dress, the kind women wore in the 1920s. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders, and her face, she looked so sad, it hurt to see. "Ella?" James said softly. She looked up at us, and I saw tears on her cheeks. "Have you seen my children?" "I can't find them. I've looked everywhere, but they're not here." My throat felt tight. "Ella, your children." "I only left for a moment," she interrupted. "The government men came and said I had to go. But I told them I had to come back for my babies. I promised them I'd never leave. I promised." "You didn't leave them," I said. "You stayed as long as you could. But they're not in their beds. I check every night and they're not there." She stood up, and I could see through her to the wall beyond. "Have you seen a boy named Robert? He's 4 years old. He has his father's eyes. And my girls, Sarah and Elizabeth, they're so small. They need their mother." James pulled out a photograph. "Ella, look, I brought pictures of your children." She moved closer, and the temperature dropped even more. Ice formed on the windows. She looked at the photograph, and her expression changed confusion, then recognition, then something like hope. "That's Sarah," she whispered. "That's my Sarah. But she's so little here. This is an old—" "It is old," James said gently. "It's from 1918. 1918? But that was—" Ella's face changed. "What year is it now?" "It's 1979, I said. She backed away, shaking her head. No, that's not right. I just left yesterday. The government men came yesterday, and I told them I'd be right back. I just needed to get my things and say goodbye to the babies, and—" "Ella, it's been 60 years, James said. "Your children aren't here anymore." "No!" Her scream shook the house. The windows rattled and something in the kitchen crashed to the floor. "No, they're here. They have to be here. I'm their mother." The temperature dropped so fast that ice spread across the floor. The walls groaned. Ella's form grew brighter, more solid, and her face twisted with rage and grief. "I promised them," she shrieked. "I promised I would never leave. Where are my babies? Where are my babies?" And then she looked at James, really looked at him. Her eyes went wide. "Robert?" she whispered. "Robert, is that you?" James took a step back. "No, Ella, I'm not Robert. I'm his cousin, his relative. But I'm not him." But Ella was moving toward him, reaching out with hands that looked almost solid now. "You have his eyes. You have my husband's eyes. Robert, my baby boy, you came back to me." "Ella, stop," I said, moving between them. "He's not your son. Your son died in 1919. All your children died." She looked at me like I'd stabbed her. "Died?" "The influenza took Sarah and Elizabeth. Robert drowned in the creek. You lost all of them, and I'm so sorry, but they've been gone for 60 years. "No." Her voice was small now, broken. "They can't be gone. I'm their mother. Mothers don't leave their babies." "You didn't leave them," James said. "You stayed with them as long as you could. You took care of their graves. You talked to them every day. But then the government made you go, and it broke your heart." Ella sank down, and the ice around us began to melt. Water ran down the walls in streams. "I couldn't leave them," she whispered. "How could I leave them all alone?" "They weren't alone," I said. "They had each other, and they had you, watching over them. But I broke my promise. I knelt down beside her, not caring that she was a ghost, that this was impossible. You kept your promise the only way you could. You came back. You've been here all this time looking for them. That's love, Ella. That's what mothers do." She looked up at me, and her eyes were so full of pain I could barely stand it. "Are they really gone?" "Their bodies are," James said. "But there's something else I need to tell you. Something I found in the old letters." He pulled out a paper, carefully preserved in plastic. "This is from your sister, written in 1927, a year after you disappeared. She writes about seeing you in a dream. She says you came to her and told her the children were with you, that you'd found them and they were safe. I don't remember that, Ella said. I think part of you already knows they're gone, James said. But part of you can't accept it. Part of you is stuck in that moment when the government men came and you had to choose between leaving or staying. You picked staying, and you've been here ever since, caught in that choice. Ella stood up slowly. She walked to the window and looked out at the cemetery on the hill. I can feel them, she said quietly. Up there, in the ground. They're so cold. They're not cold, I said. They're at peace. They've been at peace for 60 years, Ella. They're waiting for you. She turned back to us, and for the first time, I saw something other than grief on her face. I saw fear. What if they don't remember me? What if I waited too long? They're your children, James said. They'll remember. I'm scared, she whispered. I've been looking for them for so long. What if I can't find them? You don't. You have to find them, I said. You just have to let go. You just have to finish saying goodbye. We walked with her, through the melting ice, out of the house, and up the hill to the cemetery. The moon was setting now, and the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky. Ella stood at her children's graves. The headstones were exactly as they'd been, but something was different now. The air felt warmer. The oppressive sadness that had hung over this place was lifting. I'm sorry I took so long, Ella said to the graves. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. James and I stood back, giving her space. I don't know what we expected, some kind of dramatic light show, maybe, or a voice from heaven. But what happened was quieter than that. The air around Ella began to shimmer. She looked down at her hands and they were glowing, becoming transparent. They're here, she said, wonder in her voice. I can feel them. They're right here. She looked at us one last time. Thank you, she said. Thank you for helping me remember. And then she was gone. Not violently, not with a scream or a flash. She just faded away like morning mist, until there was nothing left but the empty cemetery and the sound of birds starting to sing in the trees. James let out a breath he'd been holding. Is she? She's with them now, I said. She's finally with her children. We walked back down the hill as the sun rose over the mountains. The Palmer house looked different in the dawn light, peaceful somehow, like it could finally rest. The official report said there had been unusual atmospheric conditions in Cataloochee Valley, causing auditory and visual disturbances. The Park Service ordered a full inspection of the Palmer homestead, checking for carbon monoxide leaks, infrasound from wind patterns, or anything else that might explain what people had experienced. They didn't find anything, of course. But the visitors stopped reporting a screaming woman. The temperature around the house went back to normal. The strange ice formations stopped appearing. Tom reopened the valley a week later. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it gets, in a place built on top of other people's homes. But I was different now. I understood that the buildings I took care of weren't just old structures. They were promises people had made to each other. Promises broken when the government came through and moved everyone out. Some of those promises were still being kept, in ways I was only beginning to understand. I started spending more time at the cemeteries. Not just the Palmer plot, but all of them scattered throughout the valley. I made sure they were clean. I put out flowers. I read the names on the stones and tried to remember that these were real people with real lives, people who loved this valley and didn't want to leave. James came back a month later with more family photographs. We installed a small display in the visitor center, the families of Cataloochee, with pictures and stories from before the park. People should know who lived here, James said. They should know what was lost. One cold morning in November, I was walking past the Palmer house when I noticed something on the porch. 3 bundles of dried flowers, tied with faded ribbon. I picked one up carefully. The ribbon was old, fragile, the kind they made in the 1,920 seconds. I looked up at the cemetery on the hill, and I swear I saw something just for a moment. 3 small figures standing by the graves, and a woman in white watching over them. Then I blinked, and they were gone. I kept the flowers, though I probably shouldn't have. I pressed them in a book and kept them in my desk. Sometimes, on quiet days, I take them out and look at them. I think about Ella Palmer and her children. I think about promises that transcend death and grief that echoes through generations. The valley is quiet now, peaceful. But sometimes, early in the morning when the mist is heavy, I hear things I can't explain. Not screaming, never screaming anymore. But soft sounds. Children laughing. A mother's voice, calling them home for supper. I don't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? But I know the truth now. I know that this valley holds more than just old buildings and empty houses. It holds every promise ever made here, every goodbye that went unsaid, every love that refused to die even when death came calling. And I know my real job isn't just taking care of the buildings. It's taking care of the people who loved them, all of them, even the ones who never really left. Last week, a family asked me if Catalucci was haunted. Their little girl had heard the stories about the screaming woman. I looked out at the valley, at the mountains turning gold with fall colors, at the Palmer house standing quiet and peaceful in its clearing, at the cemetery on the hill, where a mother finally rests with her children. No, I told them, it's not haunted, but it's not forgotten either. The people who lived here made this valley home, and some part of them will always be here. That's not haunting, that's just love. The little girl seemed satisfied with that answer. Me? I'm not sure what I believe anymore. But every morning when I unlock the visitor center, I say, "Good morning to the valley," to all its residents, living and dead. And sometimes I swear I hear someone say good morning back. My name is Vincent Crowley, and I've been a park ranger for 17 years. Before that, I worked the coal mines like my daddy and his daddy before him. When the mine took my father in '72, I swore I'd never go back underground. Funny how life works out. I specialize in cave rescue now. I know every tunnel, every shaft, every hollow in the Monongahela National Forest. The Blackwater Falls area is my territory, nearly 200 square miles of West Virginia wilderness that most folks never see. It's beautiful country, but it's dangerous too. One wrong step and you're falling into a cave system that goes down God knows how far. The old-timers around here always told stories about things that lived in the deep places. My grandfather used to warn me about crawler people that came up from the mines when the moon was dark. Said the Cherokee made a deal with them long ago. Stay underground and we'll leave you be. I never believed any of that nonsense. In my line of work, you see enough real dangers without worrying about ghost stories. It was March 15th, 1987, when everything changed. The winter thaw was making the ground unstable, and I'd already responded to 2 cave-ins that week. The phone rang at my station around 3 p.m. 4 college kids from Virginia Tech had permits to explore Blackwater Cave. They were supposed to check in by noon. It was now well past that, and their worried parents were calling. I grabbed my gear and headed out. Standard cave rescue protocol: check the last known entry point, look for signs of trouble, call for backup if needed. The drive to Blackwater Cave takes about 40 minutes on forest roads that twist through hills like a snake. The whole way there, I kept telling myself it would be nothing. Kids lose track of time. Equipment fails. Someone gets scared and they wait for daylight. But when I got to the cave entrance, I knew something was wrong. Their cars were still there. 2 Jeeps parked exactly where they should be. The students had followed all the rules, filed proper permits, brought the right equipment. But the cave entrance looked different. The opening was partially collapsed, which was strange because I'd inspected this cave just last month. What made my skin crawl was how the rocks had fallen. They weren't blocking the entrance from outside. They were pushed outward, like something had exploded from inside the cave. I grabbed my flashlight and rope gear from the truck. The air coming out of the cave was wrong. It was warm, maybe 20 degrees warmer than it should be in March. And there was a smell, like sulfur mixed with something rotten. No bat sounds either, which was impossible. Blackwater Cave had the largest bat colony in the county. I called out for the students. "Hello, this is Ranger Crowley. Can anyone hear me?" Nothing. Just the sound of water dripping somewhere deep in the darkness. I checked my equipment one more time. 200 feet of static rope, carbide headlamp, gas detector, first aid kit, emergency flares, everything I needed for a standard rescue. I tied off my rope to a sturdy pine tree and started down into the cave. The limestone walls were slick with moisture, but they felt wrong under my hands. scratched up, like something with claws had been scraping against them. I'd been in hundreds of caves, and I'd never seen marks like these. They were too deep, too wide to be from any animal I knew. 30 feet down, I found the first piece of evidence, a shredded backpack caught on a rock ledge. The fabric was torn in long strips, like something had grabbed it and pulled. Inside, I found a wallet belonging to Sarah Chen, one of the missing students. Her driver's license photo showed a smiling girl with long black hair. The plastic was warped and melted around the edges. That's when my headlamp started flickering. Brand new batteries, but the light was dying fast. I pulled out my backup flashlight, but it did the same thing. I'd never seen batteries drain that quickly. My gas detector was going crazy too, beeping like there was methane everywhere. But the readings didn't make sense. I kept going deeper, following the main tunnel. The cave system here was formed by an underground river millions of years ago, creating a network of passages that connected to the old coal mines. My grandfather had worked these mines before they were abandoned in the 1960 seconds. He always said the deepest shafts were cursed. 50 feet down, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was Sarah Chen's voice, calling for help, clear as day, echoing up from somewhere below me. But the acoustics were all wrong. The voice was coming from 3 different directions at once. I stopped breathing and listened hard. The voice came again, definitely Sarah, saying, "Help us, please, we're trapped down here." But now it was coming from a tunnel off to my left. Then I heard it again from straight ahead. Same exact words, same exact tone, but from completely different places. My hands were shaking as I checked my compass. The needle was spinning like a top, couldn't find magnetic north. None of my equipment was working right. But I'm a professional, and there were kids down here who needed help. I followed the main passage, moving as quietly as I could. The scratches on the walls were getting deeper, and now I could see they formed patterns. Not random scratches, deliberate marks, like some kind of writing. The Cherokee had petroglyphs in some of the caves around here, but these were different, newer. The tunnel opened into a large chamber about the size of a school gymnasium. My dying flashlight beam barely reached the far walls, but I could see the ceiling was maybe 30 feet high. The floor was covered with loose rocks and what looked like old mining equipment, rusted railroad tracks, broken timber supports, coils of cable. That's when I saw the bones. They were arranged in careful piles along the walls. Human bones, but also deer, bear, smaller animals. All of them had been cleaned completely, picked clean and white. Some of the human skulls had holes in them, perfectly round, like something had drilled through. I was backing toward the tunnel entrance when I heard footsteps above me. Someone was walking on the ceiling. I aimed my flashlight up and saw a shape moving across the limestone, but it was wrong. Too long, too pale. The thing was crawling upside down like a spider, but it was the size of a person. Maybe bigger. I fumbled for my radio. "Base, this is Crowley. I need immediate backup at Blackwater Cave. We have a situation." Static. Dead air. The radio was as useless as everything else. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath and waited. Then Sarah's voice spoke from directly above my head. "Ranger Crowley? Thank God you found us. We're hurt really bad. Can you help us get out?" I looked up. Nothing there, but darkness and stone. "Sarah, where are you? I can't see you." "Down here," came her voice from behind me, "in the back tunnel. Please, hurry." I spun around, flashlight beam dancing across the chamber. Empty. That's when I understood. Whatever was down here, it wasn't Sarah Chen. I ran. Didn't matter that I was a professional, didn't matter that I'd spent years training for cave rescues. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of that place as fast as possible. Behind me, I heard more voices. The other missing students, calling my name, begging for help. But they were coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from passages that shouldn't exist. And underneath their pleas, I heard something else, a clicking sound, like insects talking to each other. I reached my rope and started climbing, hand over hand. My arms burned, but I didn't stop. Halfway up, I heard something following me. Not climbing the rope, moving along the cave wall. Scraping. Sounds like claws on stone, getting closer. I made it to the surface and hauled up my rope as fast as I could. Whatever was down there, I wasn't giving it an easy way up. The sun was setting, painting the sky red through the trees. I'd been underground for 2 hours, but it felt like minutes. I got on my truck radio and called for backup. This time, it worked. "Jake, this is Vince. I need you at Blackwater Cave right now. Bring climbing gear and emergency lights." "What's the situation?" I paused. "How do you explain something you don't understand yourself? Just get here and bring the big floodlights." While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the cave entrance, looking for other ways in or out. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even the squirrels had gone silent. I found what I was looking for about 50 yards from the main entrance. An old mine shaft boarded up but with some of the planks pulled away. Fresh scratches around the opening. This is how they were getting in and out. Jake Morrison arrived just as full darkness hit. He's a good man, been my partner for 8 years. Steady, reliable, doesn't panic. He took one look at my face and knew this wasn't a routine rescue. "What did you find down there?" I told him everything. The voices, the bones, the thing on the ceiling. He listened without interrupting, which is why I trust him. Jake's seen enough strange things in these mountains to keep an open mind. "Could be a gas leak," he said finally. "Methane can cause hallucinations, make you see and hear things that aren't there." "Then explain the bones. Explain why all my equipment failed." Jake checked his own gear. His flashlight died within seconds of turning it on. His compass spun wildly. His radio crackled with static and voices that shouldn't be there. "Okay," he said. "Something's definitely wrong here." We set up the emergency floodlights around the cave entrance, running them off the truck's battery. The bright white light made me feel a little safer, but not much. That's when we heard the voices again. All 4 missing students, calling for help from inside the cave. But now we could hear them clearly, and what they were saying made my skin crawl. They were repeating conversations Jake and I had just had, word for word, in our exact voices. "Could be a gas leak," Jake's voice echoed from the cave depths. "Methane can cause hallucinations." But Jake was standing right beside me, and his mouth wasn't moving. "Then explain the bones," my own voice replied from somewhere underground. "Explain why all my equipment failed." We stared at each other in the harsh glare of the floodlights. Jake's face had gone pale. "We need to call this in," he whispered. "Get the state police, FBI, whoever handles this kind of thing." "What kind of thing?" I asked. "What do we tell them? That something in the cave is stealing voices?" Before he could answer, we heard footsteps. Multiple sets, coming up from the cave entrance. Slow, deliberate, like people climbing out. But when we looked, nothing was there. Just empty stone and shadows. Jake grabbed his rifle from the truck. "Standard protocol for cave rescues. Sometimes you run into black bears or wildcats." But this felt different. The footsteps had sounded human, but wrong somehow. Too many joints. Like the legs were bending in places they shouldn't. "Stay in the light," I told him. "Whatever's down there, it doesn't like the floodlights." The voices started up again, but now they were having conversations. Sarah Chen's voice talking to the other students, discussing their plans to explore the cave system. But the conversations were wrong, mixed up, like someone had taken recordings and played them back in random order. "We should split up," said one voice. "Cover more ground that way." "No," replied another. "Dad always said never go alone, underground." "Your dad's not here," laughed a third voice, but the laugh went on too long, rising and falling like a siren. Jake was sweating despite the cold. "Vince, we need to get out of here. Call in a hazmat team. Seal this place up. There are kids down there." "No, there aren't. Not anymore." I knew he was right, but I couldn't leave. Not without knowing for sure. I grabbed a flare from my gear and lit it. The red light cut through the darkness like a blade. "I'm going back down. You stay here. Keep the lights on." "Don't be stupid, Vince. Whatever's in there killed those kids." "Maybe, but I need to see for myself." I tied off a new rope and started down into the cave. The flare gave off a hellish red glow, but it was better than the failing flashlights. Behind me, I could hear Jake on the radio, trying to raise the state police. The main chamber looked different in the red light. The bone piles seemed bigger, and I could see more details in the scratches on the walls. They weren't random marks. They were pictographs, like the Cherokee ones I'd seen in other caves. But these showed human figures being dragged underground by things with too many arms and legs. In the center of the chamber, I found something that made my stomach turn. The missing students' equipment, arranged in a perfect circle. Backpacks, sleeping bags, climbing gear, cameras, all of it carefully placed, like an offering. That's when I heard Jake screaming from above. Not his voice echoing from the cave walls. Actual Jake, up at the surface, screaming for help. I dropped the flare and ran for the rope, climbing faster than I ever had before. I reached the surface to find the truck overturned and the floodlights smashed. Jake was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear his voice coming from the old mine shaft. "Vince, help me! I fell through a false floor. I'm trapped." I grabbed another flare and ran toward the mine shaft. The boards that had covered it were scattered like toothpicks. The opening was about 4 feet wide, dropping straight down into darkness. "Jake, where are you?" "Down here. Maybe 30 feet. I think my leg's broken." I lit the flare and dropped it into the shaft. It tumbled down, casting crazy shadows, until it hit bottom and went out. In those few seconds of light, I saw something that will haunt me forever. The shaft opened into a huge underground chamber, much bigger than the one I'd found earlier. The walls were lined with tunnels, like a honeycomb, stretching away into darkness. And moving through those tunnels were shapes, pale, elongated figures crawling along the walls and ceiling like insects. One of them looked up at me as the flare died. It had Jake's face. "Help me, Vince," it called in Jake's voice. "I'm hurt real bad down here." I backed away from the shaft. Around me, the forest had come alive with voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, calling from every direction. Men, women, children, all begging for help, all sounding terrified and alone. But I'd been in these woods long enough to know they were all dead. Some of those voices were speaking Cherokee, using words I'd heard from tribal elders describing their ancestors. Others sounded like coal miners from the 1922, using old-fashioned slang, all of them taken by the things in the deep places. I ran back to the overturned truck and grabbed the emergency radio. It crackled to life, filled with voices, but none of them were from the outside world. They were all from down below, in the tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the mountain. "Please help us," they begged. "We're lost in the dark. We can't find our way out." But underneath their pleas, I could hear the clicking sounds again. Inhuman sounds, like insects or spiders talking to each other in some alien language. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The Cherokee stories were real. There were things living in the deep places, ancient things that had learned to mimic human voices to lure prey. The coal mines had disturbed their territory, driven them deeper, but they were still here, still hunting, and now they had Jake. I looked around at the scattered equipment, the destroyed lights, the dark openings that led down into their domain. I was alone on the surface, but below me was a network of tunnels filled with creatures that could perfectly imitate any human voice they'd ever heard. The clicking sounds were getting louder, coming from multiple directions. They were moving through the underground passages, surrounding me. Soon they'd come up through the mine shafts and cave entrances, and I'd join the chorus of voices calling for help in the darkness, unless I did something first. I remembered what my grandfather used to say about the old mine shafts. When we hit the deepest veins, strange things started happening. Men would hear their dead wives calling to them from the tunnels. Some went down and never came back up. He'd also told me about the Cherokee warnings. The pale crawlers had lived in the deep places long before humans arrived. When the Cherokee first came to these mountains, they made a treaty with the creatures: stay underground, and the surface world would be left alone. But coal mining had broken that ancient agreement. The voices around me were getting closer, and I could see pale shapes moving between the trees. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, joints that bent in impossible directions. Their skin was the color of cave limestone, and their eyes reflected light like an animal's. One of them spoke to me in Sarah Chen's voice. "Ranger Crowley, please help us. We're so scared." But when I looked directly at it, I could see the truth. Its mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth, and its fingers ended in claws that could scratch limestone. It was wearing Sarah's jacket, but the fabric was torn and stained with things I didn't want to think about. "We just want to go home," it said, taking a step closer. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I ran back to the overturned truck and grabbed the emergency kit. Inside were 3 road flares and something I'd forgotten about, a stick of dynamite left over from last summer's landslide clearing operation. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. The creatures were following me, still calling in their stolen voices. Jake's voice, Sarah's voice, the voices of people who disappeared in these mountains over the decades. Some of them sounded like children. "Don't leave us here," they pleaded. "We're lost. We need your help." I lit the fuse on the dynamite and threw it down the main cave entrance. Then I lit a flare and tossed it down the mine shaft where Jake had fallen. The creatures scattered, their stolen voices turning into inhuman shrieks and clicks. The explosions came, seconds apart, deep underground booms that shook the earth and sent geysers of dust and rock shooting up from every opening. Trees swayed, and I could hear the tunnels collapsing, one after another, like dominoes falling. The creatures caught on the surface made sounds I'll never forget, part scream, part insect chatter, part electronic feedback. They scrambled toward any opening they could find, but most of the entrances were already blocked by fallen rock. 3 of them didn't make it underground in time. In the light of the flares, I saw them clearly for the first time. They'd once been human, maybe centuries ago, but living in the deep places had changed them. Evolution, adaptation, or something worse. Their limbs had elongated, their spine had gained extra vertebrae, their jaw structure had shifted to accommodate those needle teeth. But the worst part was their eyes. They were intelligent, aware, desperate. These weren't mindless monsters, they were trapped beings who'd learned to survive by becoming something terrible. One of them, wearing what was left of Jake's uniform, looked at me with an expression of pure hatred and spoke in my own voice. "You don't know what you've done," it said. "There are other ways up, other caves. We'll find you, Vincent Crowley. We'll find everyone you've ever cared about." Then the ground opened up beneath it, and it fell into a newly formed sinkhole with a scream that Dopplered away into nothing. The explosions had destabilized the entire cave system. Sinkholes were opening up across the mountainside, swallowing trees and boulders. The ancient network of tunnels was collapsing in on itself, burying the pale crawlers in their own domain. But I knew it wasn't over. The creature was right. There were other caves, other mine shafts, other ways to the surface. I'd only bought time, not victory. I hiked out to the main road and flagged down a state police cruiser. Told them there'd been a mining accident, a cave-in, possible gas explosion. They called in a hazmat team and sealed off the entire area. Jake Morrison was listed as missing, presumed dead in a mining accident. The 4 college students were never found. Officially, they'd been caught in an unexpected cave-in while exploring without proper permits. The families never got answers, and I never told them the truth. How could I? Who would believe that their children had been taken by things that evolved in the darkness, creatures that collected voices like trophies and used them to hunt? That was 37 years ago. I'm retired now, living in Florida where there are no caves, no mines, no deep places where ancient things might be waiting. But I still wake up some nights, hearing those voices. All those people calling for help from the darkness. The official report blamed everything on methane gas and unstable geology. The area around Blackwater Cave was declared permanently off-limits, and most of the old mine entrances were sealed with concrete. But I know it's not enough. 6 months after the incident, I drove back to check on the site. New sinkholes had opened up during heavy rains, and I could see fresh scratches around the edges. Something was still down there, trying to claw its way back to the surface. I developed claustrophobia after that night. Couldn't handle enclosed spaces, couldn't go underground for any reason. Had to transfer to surface-only duties, which raised questions I couldn't answer. The department was understanding, called it PTSD from losing my partner. But the real reason was simpler. I knew that if I went back underground, I'd hear Jake's voice calling to me from the darkness. And eventually, I'd follow it. Over the years, I've kept track of missing persons reports from the Appalachian region. Hikers, spelunkers, hunters. People who go into the deep woods and never come out. The numbers are higher than they should be, and the pattern is always the same. People hear voices calling for help, voices of family members or friends who couldn't possibly be there. The Cherokee were right to make their treaty with the pale crawlers. Some things are better left undisturbed in the deep places of the earth. I'm telling this story now because I'm old and sick, and someone needs to know the truth. The cancer's got me, doctors say 6 months at most. But before I go, I want to leave a warning. If you're ever in the Appalachian Mountains, stay out of the caves. Don't go into abandoned mines, no matter how safe they look. And if you hear someone you know calling for help from underground, someone who couldn't possibly be there, don't follow the voice. It's not who you think it is. The pale crawlers are still down there, in caves and mines and tunnels that honeycomb the mountains. They're patient, and they're hungry, and they've had decades to plan their return to the surface. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear Jake Morrison's voice carried on the air, calling my name from somewhere far underground. He's still down there in the darkness. They all are. My name is Eleanor Fitzgerald, and I've been a forest ranger for 12 years now. Before that, I spent 6 years with the ATF, that's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, chasing down illegal distilleries and gun runners across 3 states. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see in law enforcement until I transferred to the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. People always ask why I left federal work for ranging. The truth is, I got tired of the politics and the paperwork. Out here in the Red River Gorge, I deal with hikers, campers, and the occasional poacher. Clean work, simple work, or at least, that's what I thought until August of 1981. The heat that summer was something else. We hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks, and the forest felt like a tinderbox. Every day, I'd patrol the same routes through Clifty Wilderness, checking on water sources and watching for signs of illegal camping. The area I covered was about 22 miles from the nearest highway, accessible only by foot through some of the thickest forest in Kentucky. Now, I need to tell you something about this part of the mountains. For over 100 years, there's been a running battle between moonshiners and revenue agents. My grandfather used to tell stories about federal agents who went into these hollows and never came back out. The old-timers would claim something protected the stills, something that didn't like outsiders poking around. I never believed those stories. In my experience, missing federal agents usually meant one thing: they'd gotten too close to a moonshine operation and ended up on the wrong end of a shotgun. Mountain people don't take kindly to government interference, and they've got plenty of places to hide bodies where they'll never be found. But even I had to admit, there was something different about the deeper hollows. The wildlife seemed to avoid certain areas completely. Places where you'd expect to see deer tracks or to hear birds, there was just silence. Perfect, unnatural silence that made your skin crawl. The locals had names for these spots. Dead hollows, they called them. Said the trees grew wrong there, twisted and black, even in the middle of summer. I figured it was just poor soil or maybe old mining damage. The coal companies had torn up a lot of this land back in the day. My patrol area included 3 known still sites that had been abandoned for years. Every few months, I'd hike out to check on them, make sure nobody was trying to fire them up again. It was routine work, the kind that let your mind wander while your feet followed familiar trails. That's where I was headed on August 15th, when everything changed. I'd gotten a radio call that morning from my supervisor, Jim Morrison. 3 DEA agents had gone missing somewhere in Clifty Hollow. Their last radio contact was 4 days earlier, and a search helicopter hadn't been able to spot any sign of them. Eleanor. Jim's. The voice crackled through the radio static. I need you to guide a joint task force into the hollow tomorrow. DEA thinks there's a major operation running back there. I remember feeling a chill despite the 90-degree heat. Clifty Hollow was one of those dead places, a spot where I always felt like something was watching me from the trees. But 3 missing federal agents meant serious business, and if there really was a big moonshine operation running, it could explain the disappearances. Copy that. I radioed back. What's the team size? 4 DEA agents plus yourself. They want to hit every known still site in a 2-day sweep. As I signed off and started gathering my gear, I couldn't shake the memory of my last trip into Clifty Hollow. It had been 3 weeks earlier, just a routine check of the old Henderson still site. But when I'd reached the clearing where the equipment used to sit, I'd found something that didn't make sense. Fresh footprints. Big ones, bigger. than any man I'd ever met. They'd circled the old Still Foundation 3 times, then disappeared into the tree line without any exit trail. I'd convinced myself it was just a bear, maybe rearing up on its hind legs. Bears do that sometimes when they're curious about something. But bears don't leave prints that look like oversized human feet with claw marks. I'd filed a report about possible bear activity and moved on. Now, packing my gear for tomorrow's operation, I found myself thinking about those prints again. Something about them had bothered me then, and it bothered me more now. The sun was setting behind the ridgeline as I finished checking my equipment. Radio, first aid kit, compass, topographic maps, and my service pistol. Standard ranger gear for what should have been a standard operation. I had no idea I was packing for something that would change everything I thought I knew about these mountains. The DEA team met me at the trailhead before dawn. 4 agents, in tactical gear, loaded down with enough firepower to take on a small army. The team leader, Agent Rodriguez, was a 20-year veteran who'd worked moonshine cases all over Appalachia. "Ranger Fitzgerald," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Appreciate you guiding us in. What can you tell me about the terrain?" I spread my topographic map on the hood of his vehicle and traced our route with my finger. "It's rough going. We'll hit the old Henderson site first, then work our way deeper into the hollow. There are 3 other known locations, but they've been cold for years." "Maybe not as cold as you think," said Agent Martinez, the youngest of the group. Our missing team was tracking unusual activity. Lots of movement, lots of traffic. Someone's been busy back there. We hiked in single file, with me leading and Rodriguez bringing up the rear. The trail into Clifty Hollow started easy enough, following an old logging road that petered out after about 2 miles. After that, it was all game trails and deer paths winding between massive sandstone cliffs. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Even at dawn, you should hear birds singing, insects buzzing, leaves rustling with small animal movement. But the deeper we went, the quieter it got. By the time we reached the old Henderson site, the only sounds were our boots on the forest floor and our own breathing. "Jesus," whispered Agent Chen, the team's tech specialist. "Where are all the birds?" I didn't have an answer for that. In 12 years of ranging, I'd never experienced silence this complete. It felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The Henderson site sat in a natural clearing surrounded by rhododendron bushes thick as walls. Or at least, it used to be a clearing. Now, young trees had sprouted everywhere, growing with an unnatural vigor that didn't match the drought conditions. Some were already 15 feet tall, too big for the timeline since the site was abandoned. "This doesn't look right," I muttered, checking my compass. The needle was spinning slowly, unable to find magnetic north. Rodriguez was examining the old Still Foundation, a circle of stacked stones where the cooker used to sit. "There's been recent activity here. Look at these stones." He was right. The foundation had been rebuilt, the stones carefully fitted together with fresh mortar. But there was no still, no copper tubing, no mash barrels. Just the foundation and a pile of fresh wood stacked nearby. Agent Martinez was studying the ground around the foundation. "These tracks are huge. What kind of boots make prints like this?" I knelt beside him and felt my stomach drop. The same oversized prints I'd found 3 weeks ago, only now there were dozens of them. They circled the foundation in a complex pattern, overlapping and crisscrossing like some kind of ritual dance. "Maybe work boots," I said, not believing it myself. "Steel-toed, size 15 or 16. With claws?" Martinez pointed to deep gouges in the earth at the front of each print. Before I could answer, Chen called out from the edge of the clearing. "Hey, you need to see this." We found him staring up at a massive oak tree about 30 feet from the foundation. Deep claw marks scored the bark in parallel lines, starting at shoulder height and running all the way up to the first major branch 20 feet off the ground. "What kind of animal makes marks like that?" Chen asked. Rodriguez pulled out his measuring tape. "Each claw mark is about 2 inches wide and 4 inches deep. Whatever made these is big. Really big." I ran my fingers along the gouges. The wood inside was fresh and white, still seeping sap. These weren't old marks. Maybe a day or 2 at most. "Could be a bear," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were wrong. I'd seen bear claw marks before. These were different, more deliberate, more human. in their spacing. We spent another hour documenting the site before moving deeper into the hollow. The silence followed us, growing heavier with each step. Even our radio couldn't pick up the base station, though we should have been well within range. The second site was 3 miles deeper, hidden in a narrow canyon between two ridgelines. As we approached, I caught a smell that stopped me cold. The sweet, sharp scent of fermenting corn mash. "Someone's cooking," Rodriguez whispered, hand moving to his sidearm. We crept to the edge of the canyon and peered down. What we saw defied explanation. The old Murphy still was not only rebuilt, it was running. Steam rose from a large copper pot, condensing in a coil of tubing that fed into collection jars. Fresh corn mash bubbled in wooden barrels arranged in a perfect circle around the still. But there was nobody there. The fire under the still burned hot and clean, recently fed with split hardwood. The mash barrels were full and actively fermenting. Collection jars sat ready to catch the distilled alcohol as it dripped from the condenser coil. Everything was in perfect working order, as if the operators had just stepped away for a few minutes. "This is impossible," Martinez breathed. "Who's running it?" Rodriguez keyed his radio. "Base, this is Alpha Team. We found an active still at coordinates." He stopped, frowning at his radio. "I'm getting nothing, not even static." I tried my radio with the same result. The devices were working, lights came on, buttons responded, but they couldn't connect to anything. We were completely cut off. Agent Chen was studying the still setup with professional interest. "This is a sophisticated operation. Look at the condenser design, the temperature control. Whoever built this knows what they're doing." "Then where are they?" I asked. As if in answer to my question, we heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps, coming from somewhere in the trees around us. We all froze, hands on weapons, trying to pinpoint the source. The footsteps circled us slowly, staying just out of sight in the thick underbrush. Whatever was making them was big. Each step shook the ground slightly and sent small rocks skittering down the canyon walls. "Federal agents," Rodriguez shouted. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Even the still had stopped bubbling. The fire under the copper pot continued to burn, but without any sound at all. Then we heard something that made my blood run cold. The soft sound of breathing. Deep, slow breaths that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. As if we were surrounded by things hiding in the trees, watching us, waiting. "We need to go," I whispered. "Right now." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Fall back. Maintain formation." We retreated from the canyon as quietly as possible, but I could feel eyes on us the entire way. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that were too big and moved too smoothly to be human. By the time we reached the trailhead at sunset, we were all on edge. Nobody talked about what we'd seen. Nobody tried to explain the impossible still or the circling footsteps or the feeling of being hunted through the forest. But as we reached our vehicles, Agent Martinez grabbed my arm. "Ranger Fitzgerald," he said quietly. "Those claw marks on the tree. I've seen marks like that before, in a case file from 1967. 3 revenue agents disappeared in these same mountains. They found similar marks, similar tracks. What happened to the agents?" He shook his head. "They never found them. But the local sheriff wrote something in his report that I'll never forget. He said it looked like something had been protecting the moonshiners. Something that didn't want the government poking around." That night, I lay awake, thinking about the active still with no operators, the circling footsteps, and the feeling of being watched. Somewhere in the back of my mind, my grandfather's old stories about things that protected moonshine operations didn't seem quite so foolish anymore. We went back the next morning with backup. Rodriguez had called in 2 more agents and a search and rescue team from the state police. If the missing DEA agents were still alive, we were running out of time to find them. The return trip felt different from the start. The silence was deeper, more oppressive. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing sound. Worse, the trail looked wrong. Paths I'd hiked dozens of times seemed to twist in unexpected directions, leading us in circles until I had to rely entirely on my compass to navigate. When we reached the Murphy Still site, we found it exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail that made everyone stop and stare. Fresh footprints led, away from the still. Human footprints in expensive hiking boots, the kind DEA agents wear in the field. The tracks were 4 days old, based on how the edges had weathered, which matched the timeline for our missing team. They were here, Rodriguez said grimly. Question is, where did they go? The trail led deeper into the hollow, toward areas I'd never explored. According to my maps, we were heading into some of the most remote wilderness in the state, places where a man could disappear forever and never be found. Agent Santos, one of the new team members, was studying the ground with a magnifying glass. There are other tracks mixed in with the boot prints. Bare feet, but huge. Size 18, maybe 20. Moonshiners don't work barefoot, I said. Too dangerous around the stills. These aren't human feet, Santos said quietly. Look at the toe configuration. He was right. The bare footprints showed 4 normal toes and 1 oversized toe that curved like a thumb. No human foot was shaped like that. We followed the mixed trail for over an hour, climbing steadily toward a ridge I'd never seen from this angle. The trees grew thicker here, old-growth forest that blocked out most of the sunlight. Massive oaks and maples formed a canopy so dense it felt like walking through a green tunnel. That's when we started hearing the sounds. At first, it was just whispers in the trees above us, voices speaking too quietly to understand, having conversations in a language that didn't sound quite human. When we stopped to listen, the voices stopped too. Then came the wood sounds, deep creaking and groaning, like enormous trees bending in a strong wind. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so hot and humid it felt like breathing soup. Agent Chen, our tech specialist, was trying to get readings on various instruments. My GPS is showing impossible locations, he reported. According to this, we're in 3 different places at 10. Once. My own compass had given up entirely. The needle spun slowly in complete circles, unable to find any magnetic reference point. We were navigating by instinct and landmarks, but even the landmarks seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Around noon, we found the 3rd still site. The old Johnson operation had been built into a natural cave system, using the constant temperature and humidity to perfect the aging process. The cave mouth was barely wide enough for a man to enter, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and twisted vines. But the vines were moving. They writhed and twisted like living snakes, despite the complete absence of wind. As we watched, some of them reached out toward us, as if testing the air for our scent. Plants don't move like that, whispered Agent Martinez. Rodriguez drew his sidearm. Stay together. Nobody goes in alone. The cave entrance was different than I remembered. The opening had been carved wider, and the walls showed fresh tool marks. But the tools that made these marks would have to be enormous gouges 4 inches wide and perfectly smooth, as if something with claws the size of railroad spikes had scraped away the rock. Inside, we found the Johnson still rebuilt and running, just like the Murphy site. But this operation was massive. Dozens of copper pots bubbled over, carefully tended fires. Hundreds of aging barrels lined the cave walls. The entire cave system had been converted into a moonshine factory that could produce thousands of gallons. And it was completely automated. Fires burned without any visible fuel source. Mash stirred itself in wooden vats. Distilled alcohol flowed through a complex system of tubes and valves that adjusted themselves to maintain perfect temperature and flow rates. This is impossible. Chen breathed, checking his instruments. The fires are burning without consuming wood. The mash is fermenting at exactly the right rate, despite temperature variations that should kill the yeast. This violates basic laws of physics. But what really made my skin crawl was the arrangement of the barrels. They were positioned in complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Spirals within spirals. Circles that seemed to twist into dimensions that didn't exist. The longer I stared at them, the more dizzy I became. Agent Santos had found something else. There are more DEA boot prints here, but they lead deeper into the cave system. Rodriguez made the call. We follow the trail, but nobody goes anywhere alone. The cave tunnel sloped downward, branching into a maze of natural passages and carved chambers. Our flashlights seemed dimmer than they should be, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the light. The air grew thick and sweet with the smell of fermenting grain, and something else, something organic and rotten, that made me gag. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from somewhere deep in the cave system, echoing off stone walls until we couldn't tell which direction it was coming from. Humans screaming, full of pain and terror that no person should ever have to experience. "Move," Rodriguez ordered. We ran toward the sound, following passages that seemed to shift and change as we moved through them. Several times I could have sworn we passed the same chamber twice, but from different angles. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving us in absolute silence. That's when Agent Martinez disappeared. One moment he was right behind me, the next moment he was gone. No sound, no struggle, just there 1 second and vanished the next. We backtracked, searching every passage, calling his name. Nothing. "This is wrong," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We need to get out of here now." Rodriguez was studying the cave wall where Martinez had been standing. There were fresh claw marks in the stone, gouged deep enough to expose white limestone beneath the surface. Something took him, something strong enough to drag a full-grown man through solid rock. That's when Santos started screaming. The sound came from directly above us, but when we looked up, we saw only solid stone ceiling. Santos was somewhere up there, his voice echoing through the rock itself, begging for help that we couldn't give. The screaming lasted for maybe 30 seconds before it cut off with a wet, final sound that I'll never forget. Chen was backing toward the tunnel entrance, his face white with terror. "We're leaving, now." Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Which way out?" I looked around the chamber and felt my stomach drop. Every tunnel looked the same. Our entry passage had vanished, replaced by 3 identical openings that all looked wrong. The cave system was changing around us, trapping us inside with whatever had taken Martinez and Santos. "I don't know," I whispered. That's when we heard the voice. It came from all around us, speaking in a tone too deep for human vocal cords. The words were English, but spoken by something that had learned the language without understanding how human mouths were supposed to work. "Government men." The voice rumbled through the stone. "You are not welcome here. These mountains have rules older than your laws." Rodriguez pointed his gun at the ceiling. "Federal agents, show yourself." The laughter that answered him was like rocks grinding together. "I have been showing myself. You walked through my domain. You breathed my air. You tasted my hospitality." The cave walls began to move. The stone flowed like thick liquid, revealing chambers and passages that hadn't existed moments before. In one of the new openings, I caught a glimpse of Agent Martinez hanging from the ceiling, wrapped in what looked like tree roots that pulsed with their own heartbeat. He was still alive. His eyes met mine, full of pain and desperate hope. Then the opening sealed itself, and he was gone. "The old agreement stands," the voice continued. "I protect the makers of spirits, and they feed me. Your friends have become part of that feeding." Chen was hyperventilating, his breath coming in short gasps. "What are you?" "I am what grows in the deep places. I am what remembers when these mountains were young. I am the keeper of the old ways." The chamber was shrinking around us. The walls moved inward with slow, inevitable pressure. Soon, we'd be crushed or absorbed, just like Martinez and Santos. "The Moonshiners," I said desperately. "They made a deal with you." "Yes. For many generations, the makers of mountain spirits have honored me with offerings. In return, I protect their work from those who would stop them." "But times have changed," Rodriguez said. "The old ways are dying out." Another grinding laugh. "Nothing dies here. Everything feeds the mountain. Your friends are learning this." I thought about the automated head stills, the perfect moonshine operations running themselves. "You're making the moonshine now. You don't need the people anymore." "I am improving the process, but I still require tributes." The walls were close enough now that I could feel the rough stone against my back. In moments, we'd be part of the mountain's feeding system. That's when Chen pulled out a flare. "Fire," he said, his voice steady despite his terror. "You're part of the forest. You're afraid of fire." The movement of the walls stopped. "Strike it," I urged. Chen pulled the flare's ignition cord. Red light blazed through the chamber, and the walls jerked backward as if burned. The voice let out a roar of pain and anger that shook dust from the ceiling. "Fire cleanses," the voice hissed. "Fire destroys the agreements. Fire brings change." "Then maybe it's time for change," Rodriguez said. The flare's red light revealed the truth of what we were facing. The cave walls weren't stone all they were living wood, bark, and root systems that had grown together over centuries to form a vast underground organism. We were inside something alive, something that had been feeding and growing beneath these mountains for longer than human memory. And it was angry. The wooden walls rippled and pulsed like a massive heartbeat. Roots dropped from the ceiling like grasping fingers, trying to snatch away Chen's flare. The sweet smell of moonshine mash was replaced by the stench of rotting vegetation and something worse, the smell of decomposing human flesh. The fire hurts it, I realized. Keep it burning. Chen was already pulling out a second flare. The thing that called itself the Keeper of the Old Ways let out another roar, and this time we could see where the sound was coming from. The walls themselves were speaking, bark forming crude mouth shapes that moved in synchronization with the grinding voice. "You understand nothing," it said. "I am the forest. I am the mountain. I am the spirit that gives life to the corn and makes the water sweet. Without me, this land is dust and rocks." "Then explain it to us," I said, trying to buy time while Rodriguez searched for an exit. "Tell us about the old agreement." The wall in front of me bulged outward, forming a crude face of bark and twisted wood. Eyes like burning coals opened in the rough features. When the first makers came to these mountains, they found me sleeping. Their fires woke me. Their offerings fed me. In return, I blessed their work and protected them from those who would interfere. "The revenue agents," Rodriguez said. "You killed them. I fed them to the mountain, as I fed your friends. The forest grows strong on such offerings. The moonshine flows pure and sweet." Chen's first flare was burning low. He lit the second one, and the creature's face contorted in pain. But the old makers grew careless. They forgot the proper offerings. They began to rely on machines and chemicals instead of honoring the ancient ways. "So you started taking them too," I said. "I improved their methods. I perfected their craft. The stills now run themselves, blessed by my power. The moonshine they produce is perfect, touched by the spirit of the mountain itself." Rodriguez had found an opening in the far wall, but roots were already growing across it, sealing our escape route. "How do we get out of here?" The creature's laugh was like wind through dead leaves. "You don't. You become part of the mountain, part of the process. Your flesh feeds the roots. Your bones become the framework for new growth." But I was starting to understand something. "The stills," I said. "You need them to focus your power. That's why you've been rebuilding them, improving them. They're not just making moonshine, they're channeling your energy." The burning eyes fixed on me with new attention. "Clever, government woman." "Yes, the copper and fire and flowing. Water create a connection between my essence and the surface world. Through the stills, I can grow beyond these caves. Through the stills, I can spread my influence across all the mountains." Chen's second flare was halfway gone. "What happens when you cover all the mountains?" "I return the land to the old ways. No more government, no more laws from distant cities. Only the forest, and those who honor it, and those who feed it." Rodriguez was trying to force the blocked exit with his shoulder, but the roots were thick as cables. "Eleanor, we need more fire." "A lot more fire." I looked around the chamber, thinking fast. The creature had said the stills were connection points, ways to channel its power. If that was true, then maybe they were also vulnerable points. "The moonshine," I said suddenly. "It's alcohol, high-proof alcohol." Chen caught on immediately. "It'll burn." "Destroy my stills?" The creature's voice rose to a shriek. "Impossible. They are perfection. They are the marriage of human craft and forest power." But it was too late. Chen was already moving, pulling bottles of moonshine from the shelves that lined the chamber walls. The first bottle shattered against the wooden wall, splashing clear liquid across the bark surface. The second flare touched the alcohol, and the wall erupted in flames. The creature's scream was like a forest fire and an earthquake combined. The entire cave system shook, and chunks of root and bark fell from the ceiling. The walls began to writhe and contract, but now they were burning, and the fire was spreading faster than the creature could control. "The main still!" I shouted over the roar of flames. "We have to destroy the main still." Rodriguez grabbed an armload of moonshine bottles and started running toward the deepest chamber. Chen and I followed, the creature's screams of rage and pain echoing around us. The walls were trying to close, but the fire had weakened them. We forced our way through passages that snapped at us like angry mouths. The main still chamber was enormous, carved from the living rock and wood of the mountain itself. Hundreds of copper pots bubbled over fires that burned without fuel. The air was thick with alcohol vapor and the stench of burning wood. At the center of it all was the master still, a copper construction the size of a small building that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Roots and vines had grown into the metal itself, creating a hybrid of plant and machine that was beautiful and terrible to see. "That's it," Rodriguez said. "That's the heart of the whole operation." Chen was already throwing moonshine bottles at the base of the master still. The alcohol splashed across the copper and wood, running into every crack and crevice. But we needed more fire than his last flare could provide. That's when I remembered something from my ATF training. "The vapor," I said. "All this alcohol vapor in the air, if we can ignite it." Rodriguez understood immediately. He pulled out his service pistol and aimed at one of the copper condensers. "Everybody down!" The gunshot sparked against the copper, and the entire chamber exploded. The blast threw us against the far wall, but the creature's screams were worth the pain. Flames raced along every surface, following trails of spilled moonshine and alcohol vapor. The master still groaned and twisted as the fire ate away at the organic components that held it together. "My work," the creature howled. "Centuries of perfection. You destroy what you cannot understand." "We understand enough," I said, pulling myself to my feet. "We understand that some agreements need to be broken." The chamber was collapsing around us. Burning roots fell from the ceiling, and the walls were closing in as the creature's control weakened. But ahead of us, through the smoke and flames, I could see a crack of daylight. We ran for it, dodging falling debris, and grasping roots that tried to drag us back into the fire. Behind us, the creature's voice was growing weaker, its words breaking up into inhuman sounds of rage and pain. The crack of light led to a natural chimney in the rock, a shaft that angled upward toward the surface. We climbed desperately, our hands torn and bleeding from the rough stone, while below us the entire cave system burned. We emerged into daylight on a ridge I'd never seen before, coughing and gasping in the clean mountain air. Behind us, smoke poured from cracks in the rock face as the creature's domain burned from the inside out. "Is it dead?" Chen asked. I looked back at the smoking mountain and shook my head. "I don't think it can die. But I think we hurt it badly, and I think we broke its connection to the stills." Rodriguez was checking his radio. For the first time in 2 days, it crackled with static and voices. "Base, this is Alpha Team. We need immediate evac and medical support." As we waited for the helicopter, I thought about Martinez and Santos, still trapped somewhere in that burning labyrinth. They were gone, part of the mountain now, feeding something that was older than human law and stronger than federal authority. But we'd stopped it from spreading. We'd broken the agreements and burned the stills that gave it power over the surface world. At least, I hoped we had. The official report listed Agents Martinez and Santos as killed in action during a raid on an illegal moonshine operation. The explosion that destroyed the still was attributed to an accidental ignition of alcohol vapors during the arrest of armed suspects who were never found. Rodriguez, Chen, and I were all debriefed separately. We told the truth about what we'd seen, but our reports were classified at a level so high that most people will never read them. The cave system was sealed with concrete and marked as environmentally hazardous. The entire area was declared off-limits to civilian access. But I know the truth didn't die in that cave. 3 weeks after our escape, I was back on patrol in a different section of the forest when I found fresh still sites, new operations, built with the same impossible precision as the ones we'd destroyed, the same geometric patterns in the barrel arrangements, the same automation that violated the laws of physics. The thing in the mountain hadn't died. It had just moved to a new location, found new agreements with different moonshiners who were willing to trade federal agents for perfect moonshine and protection from the law. I started obsessing over finding every still in the forest. I worked 18-hour days, hiking deeper into the wilderness than any ranger should go alone. Jim Morrison tried to stop me, said I was burning out, but I couldn't make him understand. Every still I destroyed weakened the creature's power. Every operation I shut down was one less connection point between its ancient hunger and the modern world. It was dangerous work. I was attacked twice by things that moved through the trees like water and left claw marks in solid oak. But it was necessary work. The old-timers still tell stories about the spirits that protect mountain moonshine. They warn their children about the hollows where the trees grow wrong and the air tastes sweet with fermenting corn. Most people think these are just stories, folklore passed down from simpler times. But I know better. I know that some agreements run deeper than federal law. I know that there are things in these mountains that remember when the first humans arrived, things that are willing to make bargains with anyone desperate or greedy enough to accept their terms. And I know that somewhere in the deep places of Daniel Boone National Forest, in caves that don't appear on any map, the master stills are running again. Perfect moonshine flows through copper coils, blessed by forest spirits and federal agents who get too close to the truth, disappear into the mountain to feed something that will never die and never stop growing. The old ways don't die easy in Appalachia. They just find new ways to survive, new agreements to make, new offerings to accept. Every time I hear about missing hikers or vanished government agents in these mountains, I check the reports for familiar details. Oversized footprints with claw marks, trees scored by something with inhuman strength, the sweet smell of fermenting mash in places where no stills should exist. And every time I find those signs, I gather my gear and head back into the forest. Because somebody has to keep fighting the old agreements. Somebody has to keep burning the stills and breaking the connections between ancient hunger and modern prey. My name is Eleanor Fitzgerald, and I've been a forest ranger for 15 years now. I know these mountains better than anyone alive, and I know the secrets they keep. But some secrets fight back when you try to expose them. And some agreements, once broken, leave you marked for life by things that never forget and never forgive. The moonshine still flows in Clifty Hollow. The trees still grow wrong in the dead places. And somewhere in the deep caves beneath the mountain, something waits for the next group of federal agents foolish enough to follow the trail too far into the darkness. I'll be waiting too, because this is my forest now, and I'll be damned if I let anything old agreement or ancient spirit turn it into a feeding ground for horrors that should have stayed buried in the past. The war between the moonshiners and the revenue agents never really ended. It just changed sides. My name is Harrison Blackthorne, and I've been a ranger on Grandfather Mountain for 20 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these North Carolina peaks could throw at a man. I was wrong. People ask me why I chose this life. Truth is, after 8 years as a military mountaineer, civilian life felt too flat, too safe. The Army taught me to climb anything, survive anywhere, and trust my equipment above all else. When I got out, the Park Service seemed like a perfect fit. Same mountains, same risks, just helping folks instead of fighting wars. Grandfather Mountain isn't like other peaks. At 5,946 feet, it's not the tallest in North Carolina, but it's the meanest. The Cherokee called it Tanawa, the fabulous hawk. They said it watched over everything from Virginia to Georgia, and they treated it with respect that bordered on fear. Us rangers, we just called it home. The Cherokee rangers who worked with us sometimes told stories. Old stories about something they called the Ridge Runner, the guardian spirit that protected the mountain during sacred times. Most of us white folks just smiled and nodded. Mountain people have always had their tales. Bears get big up here, and in bad weather, shadows can look like anything. I never believed those stories. Not until January of 1974. The storm started on a Tuesday. Weather Service said it would be bad, but they'd been wrong before. Ice storms in the mountains are tricky things. They can turn a routine hike into a death trap in minutes. When the call came in Wednesday morning, the wind was already howling at 60 miles per hour, and ice was forming on everything it touched. We got a family of 5 up on the ridge trail. Dispatch crackled through my radio. Hikers. They missed their check-in yesterday. I grabbed my gear, ice axe, rope, emergency shelter, medical kit. The helicopter couldn't fly in these conditions, and the road to the upper trailhead was already iced over. That meant going up on foot, alone, in weather that could kill you just for being outside. The missing family was the Hendersons from Charlotte. Dad, mom, 3 kids aged 8 to 15. They'd registered for a 2-day winter hike, planning to camp at one of the designated sites below the tree line. Good people, according to their permits. Experienced hikers. But experience doesn't mean much when Grandfather Mountain decides to flex its muscles. I started up the trail at first light, though light was generous. The ice storm had knocked out power to half the county, and the sky was the color of old pewter. Visibility was maybe 20 feet on a good stretch. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, trying to knock you off the narrow trail and into the ravines below. By the time I reached 4,000 feet, something felt wrong. Not just the weather wrong, but something deeper. The forest was too quiet. Even in a storm, you usually hear trees cracking, ice falling, something. This was different. This was silence that pressed against your ears like cotton. My ice axe bit into the frozen trail with each step. The sound echoed strangely, like the mountain was hollow underneath. I'd hiked this trail hundreds of times, but today it felt alien. Unfamiliar. The landmarks I relied on seemed shifted, changed. 3 hours up the trail, I found their first campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was shredded, but not by wind. I've seen what weather can do to equipment, and this wasn't it. Something with claws had torn through the heavy nylon like it was tissue paper. Long parallel gashes ran from top to bottom, and the aluminum poles were bent into impossible angles. The Hendersons' gear was scattered across 50 yards of mountainside. Sleeping bags hung from tree branches 30 feet up. A backpack was wedged into a crack in the granite cliff face. But there was no blood, no sign of the family themselves. I keyed my radio. Static. The storm was getting Menon on, worse, and radio signals don't travel well through ice and rock anyway. I was on my own, just like I'd been on solo missions in the service. But this felt different. This felt like something was watching me. Following their trail should have been impossible in the storm, but their footprints were still visible in the ice. 5 sets of boots, heading higher up the mountain, toward the exposed ridges where no sane person goes in weather like this. The tracks looked wrong somehow, too deep, too clear, like they'd been preserved on purpose. As I climbed higher, the wind started playing tricks. It would die to nothing for a few seconds, then slam into me from a different direction. The ice patterns on the trees weren't random either. They formed shapes that almost looked like symbols, like the mountain was trying to tell me something in a language I didn't understand. That's when I heard it for the first time. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar. Something calling from higher up, the ridge, where the tree line ended and nothing but granite and sky remained. The sound cut through the wind like a knife, and it was answered by echoes that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. I checked my gear one more time and kept climbing. The Henderson family was up there somewhere, and I was their only hope. I just wished I knew what I was climbing toward. The trail above 4,500 feet barely deserved the name. In good weather, it was a challenging scramble over granite slabs and through boulder fields. In an ice storm, it was a death trap wrapped in beauty. Every surface was slick, every handhold treacherous. The wind had picked up to hurricane force, and I had to time my movements between gusts to avoid being blown off the mountain. I found the second campsite just below the tree line. This one told a different story. The tent was gone completely, not shredded like the first one, but gone. The only trace was a few metal grommets frozen into the rock. But the family's sleeping area was still there, and what I saw made my hands shake inside my gloves. 5 human-shaped depressions in the ice, like snow angels, but deeper, much deeper, and arranged in a perfect star pattern with mathematical precision. No random arrangement of sleeping people could create that kind of symmetry. Someone, or something, had moved them after they were unconscious, or worse. At the center of the star pattern was a hole in the ice about 3 feet across. The edges were smooth, melted rather than chopped. I shined my flashlight down into it, but the beam disappeared into blackness. The hole seemed to go straight down into the mountain's core, and a smell rose from it that I'd never encountered before. Sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long in a tomb. My ice axe slipped from my hand and clattered across the granite. When I picked it up, my blood went cold. The steel head was marked with deep gouges, bite marks. Something with teeth the size of railroad spikes had taken a chunk out of hardened steel. The marks were fresh, the metal still bright where something had gnawed on my equipment. I'd been carrying that axe for 8 years. It had never failed me, never even showed significant wear. Now it looked like a dog toy that had lost a fight with a grizzly bear. The footprints led away from the campsite toward the ridge proper. But these weren't the same tracks I'd been following. These were bigger, much bigger, and they weren't human. Each print was roughly human-shaped but nearly 3 feet long, with deep claw marks extending beyond what would be the toes. The stride length was impossible, 15 feet between steps. Whatever made these tracks was either taking enormous bounds or it was big enough that 15 feet was a normal walking pace. My military training kicked in. Assess the threat, evaluate options, make decisions based on facts. The facts were simple. Something large and dangerous had been here. The Henderson family was missing. I was alone on a mountain in the worst storm in years, tracking something that could bite through steel. The rational choice was to retreat, call for backup, wait for better weather. But backup was 40 miles away, and the Hendersons might not have 40 hours. If they were still alive, I was their only chance. I followed the massive tracks toward the ridge. The going got harder with every step. Above the tree line, there was no shelter from the wind, and the ice was building up on my gear faster than I could knock it off. My goggles kept fogging over, and ice was forming on my breath mask. But the tracks remained clear, as if whatever made them was immune to the storm's attempts to cover its trail. Then I saw something that made me question my sanity. The tracks split. One set continued toward the highest point of the ridge, while another set headed down a steep slope toward a series of caves I knew weren't on any map. But the impossible part was that both sets of tracks came from the same last footprint. Whatever I was following had somehow divided in two. I stood there in the howling wind, ice building up on my jacket, trying to process what I was seeing. In 20 years of mountain rescue, I'd developed a healthy respect for the difference between what's possible and what's not. This fell firmly into the not category. That's when I noticed the silence again. The wind was still roaring, ice was still pelting my gear, but underneath it all was a dead quiet that seemed to absorb sound instead of carrying it. I tried to radio base camp again. Nothing, not even static. I chose to follow the tracks toward the caves. If the family had found shelter underground, they might still be alive. The tracks leading to the ridgetop looked like they belonged to something hunting, not something helping. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of ice, but the tracks led straight to it. As I got closer, I could see that the ice formation wasn't natural. It had been shaped, sculpted into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometric forms that seemed to twist in my peripheral vision, like optical illusions carved in frozen water. Inside my head, I heard something that might have been laughter or screaming. It was hard to tell the difference. The cave mouth was tall enough for me to walk upright, but the ceiling disappeared into darkness above my flashlight beam. The walls were covered in symbols that definitely weren't Cherokee or any human language I'd ever seen. They seemed to move in the dancing light, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. 20 feet into the cave, I found them. The Henderson family was arranged in another star pattern, this time on a natural ledge about 10 feet above the cave floor. They were lying on their backs, arms at their sides, faces peaceful. They looked like they were sleeping, except for the thin layer of ice that covered their bodies like glass coffins. I scrambled up to the ledge, hoping against hope that I wasn't too late. But when I touched the father's neck, looking for a pulse, my fingers came away bloody. Not from a wound, from the cold. They were frozen solid, had been for hours. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were still breathing. I could see their chests rising and falling under the ice, slow and steady. Their eyes were open, tracking my movements. The youngest child, an 8-year-old girl, turned her head to look at me. Ice cracked around her neck like breaking glass. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. Behind me, echoing from the depths of the cave, came that sound again, not quite howl, not quite roar. But this time, I could hear intelligence in it. Purpose. It knew I was there, and it was coming. I looked back at the family one more time. The father's eyes had found mine, and in them I saw something worse than death. I saw understanding. They knew what had happened to them, and they knew what was about to happen to me. The sound was getting closer, And for the first time in 20 years on this mountain, I ran. I burst out of the cave like something shot from a cannon, my lungs burning in the thin, freezing air. Behind me, the sound was getting louder, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The ice formations around the cave entrance began to crack and shift, rearranging themselves into new, impossible patterns. My training said to stick to the established trail, but my instincts screamed to get off the ridge as fast as possible. I chose a steep descent through a boulder field, rappelling down cliff faces that would normally take hours to navigate safely. Fear makes you stupid, but it also makes you fast. Halfway down the mountain face, my rope went slack. Not frayed, not cut, slack, like the anchor. The point had simply disappeared. I looked up to see the piton I'd hammered into solid granite hanging in midair, still attached to 30 feet of rope that ended in nothing. The rock face above me was smooth, unbroken stone. The crack I'd used for my anchor was gone. I free-climbed the rest of the way down, my hands so cold I couldn't feel the rock anymore. Navigation by touch and desperation. When I finally reached a ledge wide enough to rest on, I looked back up at the cave entrance. Something was coming out. At first, it looked like a shadow moving against the storm. But shadows don't move uphill against 60-mile-per-hour winds. This thing was big, maybe 12 feet tall, and it moved wrong. Too fluid for something that size, like it was made of muscle and liquid instead of bone and flesh. It reached the cave mouth and stopped, turning what might have been a head in my direction. Even at 200 yards, even through the storm, I felt its attention like a weight. It was looking for me specifically. This wasn't random, this was personal. I started moving again, working my way along the ledge system toward what I hoped was the main trail. Behind me, the thing let out another of those sounds, closer to a roar this time, with harmonics that made the ice on the cliff face ring like church bells. An answering call came from somewhere below me, then another from the opposite ridge. There was more than one. The trail, when I finally found it, was wrong. Not damaged by the storm, I fell. Wrong. It curved in directions I didn't remember, led past landmarks that shouldn't exist, a granite formation that looked like a frozen waterfall, a stand of dead trees twisted into spiral patterns. Rock cairns that definitely hadn't been there on my way up. My compass spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. The GPS unit in my pack had stopped working hours ago, but I'd assumed that was the weather. Now I wasn't so sure. The mountain seemed to be shifting, around me, rearranging itself like a puzzle with pieces that wouldn't stay still. I tried the radio again. This time I got something, not base camp, but a voice I recognized. Jimmy Crow Feather, one of the Cherokee Rangers who worked the lower elevations. His voice was distant, distorted, but definitely him. "Harrison, you need to get off that ridge. Now." "Jimmy, where are you?" "I found the Henderson family, but they're dead, I know. Been dead since yesterday morning, but something's keeping their spirits tied to the mountain. You need to listen to me very carefully." The radio crackled with static, then cleared again. "You're not dealing with bears, Harrison. You woke up the Ridge Runner, and it doesn't like visitors during the sacred time. The storm isn't weather, it's a hunting tool." I almost laughed. Almost, but the ice formation I was looking at had just rearranged itself while I was talking, and laughter seemed inappropriate. "Jimmy, whatever's up. Here, it's big and it's hunting me. I need extraction." "No extraction, brother. Mountain won't let helicopters through until it's finished with you. This is between you and the Guardian now." The static got worse, and Jimmy's voice became harder to hear. "If you want to live, you need to show respect. Proper respect. Cherokee way. You listening?" Before I could answer, something hit the ice 20 feet behind me with the force of a wrecking ball. I spun around to see a crater in the frozen trail, still steaming. At the center was a rock the size of a basketball, but it wasn't a rock. It was ice, shaped and hurled with impossible accuracy from somewhere above. I looked up the cliff face. The thing from the cave was there, silhouetted against the storm clouds. It raised one arm, too long, with too many joints, and pointed at me. Then it did something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It laughed, not a human laugh, but something that understood humor in a way, that predated human consciousness. The sound echoed off every rock face, multiplied and twisted until it surrounded me completely. The mountain itself was laughing at my situation. I ran again, following the trail as it curved deeper into terrain I didn't recognize. The vegetation was wrong, plants that didn't grow at this altitude. Trees that belonged in different climates entirely. Ice formations that looked like frozen architecture. Too regular to be natural. The trail led to a clearing I'd never seen before, perfectly circular and 50 feet across. In the center was a ring of standing stones, each one about 8 feet tall and covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change in the stormlight. They were arranged in the same star pattern I'd seen twice before. The something in the center. 5 points. With something in the center was a person. An old Cherokee man sat cross-legged on a raised stone platform, apparently unaffected by the storm raging around him. His long gray hair hung loose around his shoulders, and he wore traditional clothing that should have left him frozen solid in minutes. But the ice and wind seemed to part around him, like he existed in a different weather system. He looked up as I approached, and his eyes held the deep brown warmth of someone very old and very wise. "You're the ranger," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "The one who doesn't believe our stories." I stumbled into the circle of stones, grateful to be out of the wind. Inside the ring, the storm seemed muted, distant. "Who are you? How are you surviving up here?" "I'm Thomas Sequoia, and I've been waiting for you." He gestured to the stone platform beside him. "Sit. We need to talk, and there isn't much time." I sat, partly because my legs were giving out anyway. The warmth inside the stone circle felt incredible after hours in the storm. "The Ridge Runner has marked you," Thomas said, "but it hasn't decided whether to kill you or test you. That decision is still being made." "Test me for what?" "To see if you're worthy to guard this mountain. The spirits need someone who understands both worlds, the one your people live in and the one that's always been here." Thomas pointed up at the ridgeline, where multiple shadows were now moving against the storm. The Henderson family violated sacred ground during a sacred time. The penalty for that is death, but their spirits are being held until justice is complete. Justice? Someone has to take responsibility. Someone has to accept the role of guardian, or their souls stay trapped forever. Thomas's expression grew grave. "The Ridge Runner is giving you a choice, Harrison Blackthorne. Face it properly, with respect and understanding, and you might live to serve. Run from it, and you'll die like a coward, and the mountain will never trust another ranger." The shadows on the ridge were moving closer, and I could hear that sound again, multiple voices now, harmonizing in ways that made the standing stones vibrate. "How do I face it properly?" Thomas smiled, but it wasn't a comforting expression. "The same way my ancestors have faced the mountain spirits for 1,000 years. With courage, respect, and the understanding that some powers are older and stronger than human beings." He reached into a leather pouch and pulled out something that looked like carved bone. A whistle, maybe, or a flute. "This will call the Ridge Runner to direct confrontation, but once you use it, there's no running, no hiding. You face it as a warrior, or you die as prey." I took the carved instrument, feeling its weight in my frozen hands. It was warm, like it had been sitting by a fire. "What if I'm not worthy?" Thomas stood, and as he did, the storm began to intensify again. The circle of stones was losing its protective power. "Then the mountain will have another ghost, and my people will mourn another friend who didn't understand the old ways." He stepped backward and began to fade into the storm. "But I think you're stronger than you know, Harrison. The Ridge Runner wouldn't have bothered testing someone without potential." As Thomas disappeared completely, the full fury of the storm returned. The standing stones cracked under the assault of wind and ice, and the shadows from the ridgeline were now moving down the slope toward the clearing. I looked at the bone whistle in my hand. 20 years of mountain rescue experience said this was insane. Every survival instinct I had screamed to get out of this clearing and find shelter. But the Henderson family was still up there, trapped between life and death, and something told me that running would only postpone the inevitable. The Ridge Runner had marked me, and it would hunt me across every mountain in North Carolina until this was settled. I put the whistle to my lips and blew. The sound that came out wasn't music. It was something primal, something that spoke to parts of the brain that predated language. It cut through the storm like a blade, echoing off every cliff face and canyon wall. The wind died instantly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. From the ridgeline came an answering call. Not the howl roar I'd been hearing, but something more complex. Almost like speech, if speech could be made of thunder and avalanche. The ridge runner was coming to meet me. The silence stretched for exactly 13 heartbeats. I counted them, each one loud as a drum in the suddenly still air. Then the mountain began to shake. Not an earthquake, not an earthquake. This was something moving underneath the granite. Something massive, displacing tons of stone with each step. The sound built like approaching thunder, but with a rhythm that spoke of intelligence, of purpose. Whatever was coming knew exactly where I was. The shadows I'd been tracking all day began to converge on the stone circle, from multiple directions. As they moved closer, I could see they weren't shadows at all, but absence, holes in reality shaped like enormous wolves. They moved with liquid grace across terrain that should have been impossible to navigate, flowing around boulders and up cliff faces like water running uphill. But these weren't the ridge runner. These were something else, something smaller. Scouts, maybe. Or witnesses. The real presence announced itself when the standing stones began to resonate. Each granite pillar started to vibrate at a different frequency, creating harmonics that made my bones ache. The symbols carved into their surfaces flared with cold blue light, the same color as the ice formations throughout the mountain. The light pulsed in rhythm with the approaching footsteps, and I realized the entire stone circle was some kind of amplifier, a way for the ridge runner to communicate with human senses. When it finally appeared at the edge of the clearing, my mind tried to reject what I was seeing. The ridge runner stood nearly 12 feet tall, on legs that bent wrong, too many joints, like a wolf's hind legs scaled up to impossible size. Its torso was humanoid but covered in thick fur that shifted color with the light, sometimes silver, sometimes blue-black, sometimes the white of fresh snow. But it was the hands that made my breath catch. They ended in claws the length of railroad spikes, curved and gleaming like polished obsidian. Its face was the worst part. Almost human, but stretched and altered into something that belonged in nightmares. Intelligent golden eyes that held more knowledge than any living thing should possess. When it looked at me, I felt measured, evaluated, judged by standards I couldn't begin to understand. It spoke, and its voice was the sound of glaciers moving, of mountains settling into new shapes. You called, small guardian. The words weren't English, weren't Cherokee, weren't any human language. But I understood them anyway, the meaning arriving in my mind without passing through my ears. I came to help the family, I said, surprised that my voice still worked. The family violated sacred ground during the time of deep winter. They camped where spirits walk freely, in places meant only for the dead. The ridge runner took a step closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from its body like a physical force. Their punishment was swift. Their souls remain because justice is incomplete. What kind of justice? Someone must accept responsibility for their transgression. Someone must stand guardian over the sacred places, must ensure that others respect the old boundaries. Its eyes fixed on mine with laser intensity. That someone will be you, or you will join them in the ice. I thought about the Henderson family, frozen but aware, trapped in a state between life and death. I thought about 20 years of rescuing people from this mountain, and how many times I'd dismissed Cherokee warnings as superstition. If I accept this guardianship, what happens to them? Their souls go free. They find the rest that was denied them. The ridge runner's expression softened slightly, becoming almost sad. They were good people, Ranger. They simply did not understand the consequences of their choices. And if I refuse? The creature's laugh was like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Then you die badly, and I must hunt for another guardian. The mountain grows tired of being disrespected by those who should know better. Around the clearing, the shadow wolves had formed a complete circle. There was no running from this choice, even if I'd wanted to. But as I stood there, facing something out of humanity's oldest nightmares, I realized something unexpected. I didn't want to run. 20 years on this mountain had taught me to respect forces bigger than myself. Weather, gravity. The simple fact that nature doesn't care about human plans or human lives. The ridge runner was just another force of nature, older and more complex than I'd imagined, but following rules that made sense in their own way. What would being a guardian mean? You continue your work as before, but with deeper understanding. You learn to sense when the sacred times approach, when the boundaries between worlds grow thin. You guide others away from dangerous places and dangerous times. The Ridge Runner moved closer, and I could smell something like pine needles and winter morning on its breath. And when necessary, you communicate with my kind. You become a bridge between the world that is seen and the world that is hidden. Will I still be human? More than you are now. Less than you were before. Its claws gestured to the standing stones around us. The mountain will mark you, Ranger. You will see things others cannot, know things others do not, but you will remain yourself. I thought about Thomas Sequoia, appearing in the middle of a killer storm without any protection. I thought about Jimmy Crowfeather's voice on the radio, knowing things he shouldn't have been able to know. Others have accepted this before, for generations beyond counting. But always, the guardian must choose freely. The mountain cannot force this responsibility on unwilling shoulders. The wind had begun to pick up again, and ice was starting to form on the standing stones. Whatever window of opportunity this conversation represented was closing. If I say yes, what happens right now? You face the mountain's judgment. You prove worthy of the trust being offered, or you die in the attempt. The Ridge Runner's eyes glowed brighter in the growing storm. There is no shame in refusal, but there is no survival either. I looked around the circle one more time. The shadow wolves watched with eyes like cold stars. The storm was building back to full fury, and soon this clearing would be just as deadly as the rest of the mountain. But somewhere up on the ridge, the Henderson family waited for justice, for release from a nightmare they'd never asked for. I accept. The Ridge Runner nodded slowly, as if this had been the expected answer all along. Then we begin. It raised one massive clawed hand, and the standing stones exploded with blue-white light. The symbols carved into their surfaces began to move, flowing like liquid fire around and around each pillar. The mountain itself seemed to lean in, listening. Kneel, Ranger, accept the mountain's mark. I knelt in the center of the circle, feeling the warmth of ancient stone beneath my knees. The Ridge Runner placed its hand on my forehead, and the world exploded into sensation. I felt the mountain's history flowing through me, centuries of weather and erosion, the slow dance of seasons, the patient work of growing and dying. I felt the Cherokee families who had made pilgrimages to these heights, the respect and fear they'd brought with them. I felt every storm, every landslide, every moment of beauty and terror this place had witnessed. And I felt the other guardians, scattered across the Appalachian chain like points of light in a vast network. Rangers and tribal elders, park officials and mountain guides, all carrying a piece of the old knowledge, all serving as bridges between worlds. The pain was incredible, like being struck by lightning while drowning in ice water. But underneath the pain was something else, a sense of connection, of belonging, of being part of something vast and ancient and important. When the light faded and the Ridge Runner removed its hand, I was still myself, but I was also more. I could feel the mountain's mood like a change in barometric pressure. I could sense the places where the boundary between worlds was thin, the times when ordinary people should stay away. "It is done," the Ridge Runner said. "You are marked, Ranger. The mountain accepts you as guardian." Above us, the storm was beginning to clear. Real clouds, not the supernatural fury that had been hunting me all day. And from somewhere up on the ridge came a sound like wind chimes, like voices singing a lullaby. The Henderson family, finally free to rest. What happens now? Now you go home. You file your report. You continue your work. The Ridge Runner was already beginning to fade back into shadow and storm. But you watch, and you listen, and when the mountain calls, you answer. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing. "Welcome to the true work, Guardian. Try not to die too quickly." Then it was gone, leaving me alone with the melting ice and the first stars beginning to show through the breaking clouds. The descent took 4 hours. Real time, measured by a watch that had started working again somewhere around 4,000 feet. The trails were back where they belonged, the landmarks familiar and comforting. By the time I reached the ranger station, the storm had blown itself out completely, leaving behind the kind of crystalline winter night that makes you remember why you love the mountains. My supervisor, Frank Morrison, was waiting with coffee and a dozen questions. I gave him the abbreviated version. Family found deceased, apparent exposure, Solo recovery impossible due to weather conditions. The bodies would have to wait for a helicopter extraction once the ice cleared. Frank accepted the report without argument. He'd been on these mountains for 30 years, and he knew that winter storms could turn routine rescues into survival ordeals. What he didn't ask about was the gear damage, the impossible timeline, or why my compass had been spinning in circles when I stumbled back into base camp. Maybe he didn't want to know. Or maybe he knew more than he was saying. The official report went into the files as a standard exposure fatality. The Henderson family's bodies were recovered 3 days later, found in a natural shelter cave where they'd apparently sought refuge from the storm. The coroner listed cause of death as hypothermia, with a note about the strange preservation of the remains despite the temperature fluctuations. Nobody asked about the symbols carved into the cave walls or why the family had been arranged in such a precise pattern. Some questions, I was learning, were better left unasked. But the real changes started about a week later. I'd been sleeping badly since the Ridge Runner encounter, waking up at odd hours with the absolute certainty that something was wrong somewhere on the mountain. The first time it happened, I tried to ignore it. The second time, I called dispatch to check for any emergency calls. The third time, I got dressed and drove up to the lower trailheads, just to be sure. That's how I found the college kids, 4 students from Appalachian State, winter camping without proper permits in an area that was off-limits during January. They'd set up their tents in a grove of ancient hemlocks that I somehow knew, without being told, was sacred ground. The knowledge sat in my mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. I could have written them citations and sent them packing. Instead, I explained about winter weather patterns, about the increased risk of avalanche in that particular area, about the Cherokee history of the site. By the time I was finished, they were voluntarily packing up and moving to a designated camping area 2 miles away. They thanked me for the education and the gentle handling. I thanked whatever powers were listening that I'd been able to guide them away from danger without having to explain how I'd known to look for them in the first place. The pattern repeated itself throughout the rest of the winter. A hiking group planning a dangerous route during unstable weather. A rock climber preparing to tackle a cliff face on a day when I could feel the mountain's restlessness like an itch between my shoulder blades. A family of tourists who'd somehow gotten the idea to visit a particular waterfall during what my new instincts told me was a period of spiritual significance. Each time, I found a way to redirect them without mentioning the real reasons. Weather concerns, permit issues, wildlife activity. The excuses came easily, and people were usually grateful for the local knowledge. Jimmy Crow Feather started showing up at the ranger station more often, always with some official reason, coordination between tribal land and park service, updates on traditional use areas, that sort of thing. But the real conversations happened during coffee breaks, when he'd share stories about other guardians, other mountains, other times when the old world and the new world had to find ways to coexist. It gets easier, he told me one afternoon in March, when the first spring wildflowers were starting to bloom on the lower elevations. The knowledge settles in, becomes part of your normal thinking. After a while, you won't even notice when you're using the extra senses. Do you ever regret it, taking on this responsibility? Jimmy smiled and looked out the window toward Grandfather Mountain's snow-covered peak. You ever regret becoming a ranger in the first place? Same question, same answer. He was right. The guardian role didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the completion of something I'd been moving toward for 20 years without realizing it. The mountain had always been my partner in rescue work. Now I could hear its voice more clearly. By summer, I'd developed a reputation for uncanny timing and perfect weather sense. Other rangers started asking for my input on backcountry conditions, and I found myself in the unofficial role of senior wilderness advisor. The respect felt good, even though I couldn't explain the real source of my insights. The nightmares about the Henderson family stopped around the same time. I'd wake up, sometimes with the memory of that bone whistle in my hand, but the dreams were peaceful now. The family had found their rest, and their gratitude was a warm presence in the back of my mind. Thomas Sequoia appeared one more time during a particularly busy weekend in October, when the fall colors had drawn thousands of visitors to the mountain. I was patrolling the upper trails when I found him sitting on a granite outcrop, watching a group of photographers work with the golden afternoon light. "How are you settling into the work?" he asked, as if we'd been having an ongoing conversation instead of meeting for only the second time. It's different than I expected, more subtle. The best guardian work usually is. Flash and drama are for the movies. Real protection happens quietly, when people never know how close they came to danger. We watch the photographers pack up their equipment and head back down the trail, chattering excitedly about the shots they'd captured. Will I ever see the Ridge Runner again? Thomas considered this for a long moment. Probably not, unless there's another crisis. It trusts you now, and trust is a rare thing for the old spirits. He stood and brushed dust off his traditional clothing. But you'll feel its presence sometimes, especially during the sacred times. And you'll know that the mountain is watching, approving of the work you're doing. As he walked away, Thomas called back over his shoulder. Oh, and Harrison? Try to train a replacement before you retire. The mountain prefers continuity in its guardians. That was 18 months ago. I'm still here, still doing the work, still learning new aspects of what it means to be a bridge between worlds. The Park Service thinks I'm just an exceptional ranger with great instincts. The Cherokee Rangers know better, but they keep their own counsel. Sometimes, usually during the deep winter months when the boundary between worlds grows thin, I feel the Ridge, runner's attention like a warm presence at the edge of perception. It's watching, evaluating, making sure I'm living up to the trust that was placed in me. I am, and I always will be, because Grandfather Mountain chooses its own protectors, and once chosen, you belong to it forever. The work continues,